these were the two items that I had pulled up for the agenda today. I have a little bit of an update for folks, maybe less an update, more of a get other folks' eyes on it and troubleshoot on some of the testing that came out of our discussions 2 weeks ago around socializing extensions that were previously version specific, but that are potentially utilizing R5 data types. So we had some conversations around use within the publisher versus use within simplifier, and I have done a little bit of light testing today, and I wanted to share where I'm at and hopefully maybe get some folks' eyes on the JSON to see if I'm missing something. And then what I had after listening to the recording of 2 weeks ago, our session, I think we're turning to the analysis around obligations, but this time focusing on producers, because I think we've kind of struggled to come up with default rules that could be applied consistently. And we tried to tackle consumers last time and ran into some of the same kind of hurdles. So I thought we might start with producers today and see if we can kind of work through it. Lorraine, I see you got your hands up.
Yeah, just a quick comment. The Gender Harmony Project is running into the same problem about extensions with that have R5 data types, but they're on R4. So FHIR has been working on instructions about how to structure things when you want to backport that. Yep. And that's been ongoing. I'm sure it's going to settle within the next week or two.
Ah, okay. So I'm curious because actually I pulled up one of the examples and I'm wondering if it was structured a little bit differently than I was expecting. So that might be something to try. So you said it's a couple weeks still.
It's not quite settled as of this past Monday's call. Rob McClure was still talking to FHIR about getting the exact go forward settled, but I'm sure it'll be settled in the next week or two.
Okay. All right. Well, I can show folks kind of like what I'm seeing, and then we can maybe talk about like, because I think last week, Lorraine, the other thing you mentioned was a little bit about how the backporting was happening. And so it might be helpful to just keep eyes on it, because I know, there is interest in socializing some of the extensions, particularly out of the Gender Harmony Project. So we can just take a look at where we're at. Anything else that we want to make sure makes it on the agenda today? All right. I will, now keeping in mind, I think what Lauren was mentioning, which is that it sounds like the community is maybe experiencing similar challenges. One of the things that I had done just to kind of go back to what we said we would want to assess and then analyze before starting to socialize some of these previously R5 extensions. I have a test project that I use in Simplifier whenever I'm trying to test something out new. And what I did was I took the extension definition for individual reported sex and gender and attempted to just kind of follow it directly, keeping in mind now that there might actually have to be a slight difference in modeling. But I just wanted to show you folks what I was seeing with this existing modeling. If this is an R4 project, by the way, in Simplifier. And so you can see I tried to like slim this down to its most basic piece, which is just, can I provide the first value of this complex extension? And like just provide a value for this complex extension that doesn't even have that codable reference that we were talking about 2 weeks ago as a R5 data type. So I took so complex extensions you'll typically see like an extension, the URL for said extension, and then they're further extended with each of their elements. So if I pull up reported sex and gender, right? So this is an extension with a URL of value. This is an extension with a URL of type, extension of effective period, so on and so forth. That's kind of how it looks like if you were modeling it and this was an R4 extension. And I'll put it out to folks, like, is there anything that you're seeing here in the modeling actually that could be driving? I'll show the validation behavior. Because I got some kind of weirdness and I wanted to just make sure it wasn't anything that I was doing with how I was modeling it versus maybe it's that it needs to look more like I think it was like a basic resource. But this was the error that I was getting. Does this look similar, Lorraine, to what you heard coming out of section gender harmony? It's like some type of error, because I was getting an error in IG Publisher that also was a bit strange.
Well, they hadn't actually said they were actually testing it yet. They were still discussing how it was going to happen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Is this, you're using an R5, you're trying to use an R5 structure definition in an R4 project?
Basically, because the thing about the gender harmony material and others is that they're using codable reference, which is in R4. So
No, but the error that Sheridan was talking about, the additional bindings, is that something that's in R4?
I think it is because we use it in IPS.
Okay.
But it's not, I mean, it's only showing up in the snapshot. It seems to be applying on something that I didn't enter. So when we look at, I'll just pull up the JSON real quick. Yeah, so there's no place where, I mean, it's a very simple instance, right? Just a single identifier.
Oh, it is. Sorry.
Yeah. It's hard to know whether the IG publisher error is related to this or something else. Clearly, it's basically saying, I recognize you're referencing an extension that's under this R5 package, but then I'm getting something weird when it says trying to retrieve the FHIR package for R5 core. So I'm not sure if that's 100% related to my use of this extension, or maybe something's just temporarily funky with that package in the registry.
I think you've got two things going on here. The first was that so this is a R4 project or an R5 project?
This is an R4 project.
Okay, so you had additional bindings in there somewhere, right?
No.
Or you've got an extension that has additional bindings in its definition.
Oh, actually, that's a good point. So let's take a look at that.
Binding dot additional doesn't exist in R4.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's coming in the snapshot. The additional, I don't see additional binding as an element that's actually called out in the snapshot of this extension. Am I missing it in the potential values?
Well, the error message was referencing the patient profile, not the actual extension. If we go back to your error message.
You go back to the validation.
The resolution of structure definition patient failed.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever the fourth element in your snapshot is.
If it's counting the extension, it would be name.
No, that's your instance. It's in the in the profile.
So it's expecting effectively a additional binding because of the way that value codable concept is defined in R5.
Can you paste to the URL for that validation result?
Yes, I'll put it in the chat.
Ooh. Okay.
Hmm.
So this is trying to validate your patient instance against the patient structure definition. The R5 patient structure definition. And it's failing because an R4 project doesn't know what an additional is in the structure definition of patient.
Because the snapshot that would be generated would generate an additional as part of the patient structure definition elements.
Well, I guess it's using the R4 structure definition and looking at an R5 instance of the structure definition, that is the patient resource, and saying there's something in here that I don't recognize.
So
This is, I would take this up with Firely.
yeah, well, and that was kind of part of the original thought behind this, was like to determine if we use something that is understood as something that was previously published as an R5 extension, do both tooling suites that we utilize accommodate for them? And so is the answer, it's likely, given the error we're experiencing, that right now the tooling suites wouldn't accommodate for at least instances where we were trying to provide this example? Because I don't think I got a failure on the, oh, actually, let's take a look. This was basically I just created a profile on patient and I said, here's the extension. The extension is individual recorded sex or gender. Okay, it's getting the same piece. This was the instance and this is the profile. So they both have the same issue with validation. So, I think that points to, even if we aren't necessarily leveraging the R4 or R5 data types in some of these extensions, that there's a lot that's happening in the background of the tools that they'll have to be similarly prepared to backport and interpret for us to even go to the point of, like, I think it's like the authoring, utilizing these. But what I can do is take, the example that we had baked up today and say, this is what, we're considering trying to use and socialize extensions that are part of the extensions registry that previously were versioned. We utilize the FHIR project for Canadian baseline and are doing testing to see how these extensions are currently being rendered so that we can use them and request effectively beyond. I think it might be worth trying this with an R5 extension that isn't the one that uses the data types from R5, but to provide support for this in one of the upcoming releases. Because, even if we use IG Publisher, I think the challenge is just going to be a lot of folks do interact with our profiles from the standpoint of using Simplifier. Anything we should add to that request for troubleshooting and improvement?
No, I think that's okay. And I think we should just watch what happens, particularly next as we come into the HL7 meeting in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
you know, what the advice is from FHIR around the stuff.
Yeah, and I know from the Canadian perspective, you know, as we look more and more, particularly in the space of patient summary, at utilization of this to get around the challenges around patient gender, that, you know, hopefully we can add some flavor to those conversations to prioritize.
I mean, the
support.
workaround is to build an extension that looks exactly like the R5 extension with R4 data types, if we need to, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think alignment with however FHIR is recommending we do this is useful. I think the main, as far as I know, we haven't hit issues other than quotable reference. I don't know. There may be others. I just don't know about them.
Okay. Yeah, it might be worth just, like I said, to do a test with, like, is it offhand, does anyone know an extension that was published exclusively in R5 that that wouldn't have had quotable reference?
Hard to find people that they have extensions registry. Find something that's not in R4.
Sorry, Ellie, we're just a little garbled there.
Sorry, just looking at the extensions registry and compare what's in R5 to R4, should be able to grab any of them.
Let's see. Where's the I can just jump between them, but does the extensions registry have a comparison like we do with the structure definitions?
No.
Okay. R5QA.
Yeah, the challenge is that they've moved extensions around. It's in core of R4.
Okay, so what we'd be basically doing would be to identify one for the test, an extension that isn't listed here, but is listed in the R5 that doesn't use the data type. Okay. That seems like not a fun exercise, but hopefully we can find one. I think it's worth at least validating, because truly, like, there is an impact to us as potential users if holistically we can't use anything in this R5 that comes out of R5.
It's a problem for people other than us too. So
yeah. All right. I'm actually just going to make a new slide so that I have this for the next time. Okay, so for basically, I think we've got two options. We can take a look and see and use the time on the call to actually try this with a different extension, or we can jump into our obligation focus on producer topic. Does anyone have a preference one way or the other? Okay. I think with that in mind, I may bring up the obligations for producers, just because I know it's an exercise we've been working at for a while, and that this bucket may go on to have some follow-up updates in our next profiling session. All right, so to refresh folks, I will make this more reasonably sized. To refresh folks on kind of the conversations that we've been having around obligations, we effectively, have been analyzing how we would apply them in the baseline, whether or not that like viable for our particular sets of expectations as a baseline implementation guide. And, you know, I think we've come to the agreement that while we may not be ready to say, yes, let's move over to using obligations, we can at least kind of go through the process of saying, okay, if we were to, this is how we would apply them, and go through the kind of mental exercises of trying to identify which obligations we'd use, so that as we run into kind of questions, or as we run into places where, you know, we do need to further explore like impacts to things like derivative profiles, we can try to get ahead of those, as opposed to kind of waiting for this to come down the pipeline. So we're contributing to the use of these in the community, as opposed to being passive consumers. So we tried doing this with, speaking of consumers, we tried doing it with the consumer obligations last session. And I think, you know, in re-reviewing the content, I think we really struggled, because a lot of times it's difficult for iGuides, particularly ones that orient around bases or cores, to make expectations of the receiving systems for data. Oftentimes we focus on what a producing system should, you know, a server should be able to accommodate when it's queried, as opposed to what does the app do, or what does the, you know, that downstream server do that's receiving the information, and what expectations do we have for them. So one of the things that we did last time was kind of review that challenge that we had, and the challenges it's surfacing in the International Patient Access, this is also going through this exercise. We tried to do a little bit of discussion around default rules, whether or not, like, as a baseline, we can say, okay, well, this is typically a code that in most places is too strong, so starting with this code might make sense. And I think we had a number of kind of examples in the last few sessions where it became kind of challenging to apply a rule consistently, even in the space of immunization. So, and I would say particularly because I think we're coming at this from the perspective of a baseline. So we do have some kind of outstanding questions around default rules, but I think it might be more helpful to talk about the producer side of things, and then come back to these questions around, do we need them when there are other rules in place effectively that achieve the means that we desire. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up, I've got it so that we can actually kind of review the obligation and actually go through this exercise and have something that's documented that we can look back on. But let me just pull up, I guess I'm in the right place. I think it's in, let's see. So it's just been ported over in the last month to for this being the source of truth in the extensions registry. I'll put it in the chat so folks can follow along. The thing that I'm going to narrow in on when we're reviewing from a producer perspective is going to be this first element for code and the value set that's utilized for populating the obligation code. So as a reminder to folks, kind of fundamentally, there are really two components to any use of obligation. The first is a description of your expectation in a codified manner. And then the second is the actor. And there's other components to obligations as well, like, you know, you can define further what your documentation is. And there's, you know, ways of providing additional details, like, you know, the filters and processes for utilizing those obligations. But for the most part, the community that's kind of interested in exploring the use of these is really kind of starting with how would we work through this code actor, so expectation actor pairing. So I'm going to hop to the obligation codes value set. And I'm actually, I hope this doesn't bother people, but I like seeing it like this. This is how I'm going to do it. And we'll look at, I'll just frame this very briefly, but effectively, looks like, so effectively there's a couple different groupings. We've got modifier codes, right? Shall, should, resource producer obligations. So these would be like, if you are producing the content in a almost like host versus recipient relationship. These are the codes that would apply to that behavior as a producer, and then exchanger obligations, which would be like if you're an intermediary, if you're facilitating the exchange, and the consumer obligations, which is you are receiving the resources. What are the expectation codes that go along with that set of behaviors? There's aggregate concepts as well. Some of them coming, I think, from our previous ways of describing in like V2 and IHE what our expectations are. So I think the goal is to be a bridge for prior ways of and other standards use of consumable structured expectations. I haven't been on a group that's utilizing a lot of these yet, but I anticipate that they would be heavily used in some of the cross-SDO use case or implementation guides. So for the consumer side, I'm just going to scroll up. And I did put that in the chat. Good. So we looked at the consumer ones 2 weeks ago, and I think 2 weeks before that. I want to focus on the producer ends today, because I think we had like a lot of cases where there's examples where we wouldn't want to like refine or restrict a receiving system or an app, given our philosophy, but our tenets around trying to kind of harmonize around capabilities might be better suited towards trying to kind of translate our must supports into producer obligations, because it's about what servers should be able to do. And that in a way provides consumers with some expectations for what's available to them. So the common ones I think we've been talking about a little bit is can send and will send. We've touched on use reason a couple sessions ago in its use of, for instance, or in its interpretation of requiring the producer to be able to provide a data absent reason on elements where this obligation is applied when no value is known. So it's kind of like another way beyond just applying a DAR extension to enforce its use and it's the system behavior around its use in production. There is a bunch more around narrative, what you do in UI, whether you store it, and others that provide us the ability to really discreetly describe in our implementation guide what our expectation is. I think for the most part, even in our current must support definitions, we've always said like, we will not go into the depth of describing the business rules around use and storage and what you do with the data that you receive. And so I imagine we'll want to avoid these, but I'm curious if there's folks who do want to look at these and walk through the definitions in more detail. Okay. So if we're not as interested, I think, in the expectation codes around storage or display, then what we're really left with is kind of this can send, will send use reason. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about the differences between can send. I think the biggest pieces we've highlighted in the past, which is this is more, I feel like can send is around demonstration. So like it's solely on, does your system have the capability? Where will send also implies some expectation of behavior at the time of like record exchange in production, which is your system will send values or populate elements when it has the value that's appropriate and available for that element. So that's kind of like going one step further than just, do you have the capability of capturing and relaying? When we think about that in the context of baseline and our current must supports on anonymization, where do folks feel, maybe we'll start with the reactive method. what do folks think is not appropriate as a producer code for immunization expectations?
Sure, then just a quick question.
Mhm.
This words can send, will send, are those already codes that are used or defined in FHIR right now? Or is this being defined? The reason I'm asking is typically we would use the word shall, or should, or may to indicate which ones is required or mandatory. Are those already cast in stone, the can and will?
No, I don't. I think this is very much still a evolving definition that we can help contribute to. So where we have questions, and I think so, questions around how do I interpret this, shall, should use here is absolutely helpful to the folks who are refining out this value set.
Yeah, I'm actually looking at the modifier code column itself rather than using can send. Use, you know, or sorry, will send. We'll use a shall, right? Or
Well,
should
there's
send.
already there. If you look up at row 2 and 3, shall and should are also in this code set.
Yeah, so maybe for consistency, rather than using can and will, and then redefining what can and will mean, you know, it's already defined as shall is
Well,
equivalent to will.
There's a little bit of difference between can and shall, right?
The way I read this is you would have a can send obligation, and then you modify it into a shall send or a should send. So the can send code indicates what the activity is, and the modifier says what the conformance requirement on that activity. I would expect to see both of those used.
Let's take a look at the definition real quick, because I think that it makes sense as a combination. The only thing is right now, it's a code, yeah. So it's a single code and it's a maximum of 1, which I think, so if this is the element that you apply it to, well, technically you can apply it directly on the element, but if this is let's say it says can send here, and my actor is a FHIR server, how would you, like, do you see a way through to add the modifier in this current model to the modifying of can send?
Codes potentially a combination code that describes an obligation. So how do we come up with a combination code?
Yeah. I was thinking you might use like shall here, FHIR server in Canada here, and then your documentation would be like, shall do this, right? Do X. That it might not actually be covered by the X behavior might not be defined in the code extension, but rather in the documentation. But yeah, I have no idea. I don't know how folks are using the modifier codes. Might be a good question to surface. Because going back to your question, Finny, which is like, will, I feel like may be more aligned to shall than can is actually aligned to should, because a lot of times we want to say you have to have this capability, but that doesn't mean that you should always, but we're saying you should always send something there.
So what
if we go to the code system definition, it actually defines a grammar. So up at the top, it says qualifier codes should, may, shall, should, may, functional codes, composite codes. Functional and qualifier codes are combined using the syntax modifier :
Mhm.
obligation. For example, shall, will send.
Okay, so
So
if
that turns the activity of will send, or the function of will send, into a shall requirement.
what do folks think? Is that useful for, like, I'm just gonna put like just an example. If we were to say, you know, should, and then what our expectation is. Should we think about this as a combination of should or shall plus the functional code? Would there be like combinations we would expect? I'm thinking probably like, well, how would folks interpret should, will, send?
It is a
That would tell me that-
recommendation that
Go ahead, Elliot.
it's a recommendation that the implementation provide that value. But it isn't a strict requirement that it does.
And Lorraine?
I was basically going to say the same thing. It says a server that's conformant to this profile is recommended to be able to provide the value, but if it doesn't, it's not. If it doesn't, it's okay. It's not a conformance mandatory.
So
That's what that says.
yeah,
to me.
that that would open up, I think, a lot more for us in that we're, you know, if we have this modifier element, we make a lot more recommendations than we do hard conformance rules. Typically, that's how we've talked about our must support in the
Yeah.
past.
And actually, if I look at the way the table's laid out, I think it's the expectation is that we're combining the shall, should, may with the obligation codes. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. That's how I read it.
So from a reactionary standpoint, do we think that we would use shall at all?
It would be a
Standard
very small
architects-
case.
I was going to say small cases, the standard architecture's answer, it depends, right?
It'd be pretty hard to say there's no place where we would do that.
Yeah, but in the baseline, I think we'd have to be careful about saying shalls. But that doesn't mean we would never say shall.
So let's talk about status then. Like, status is something that already has a minimum cardinality on it. If we play this out, if we said shall can send, what would that mean for immunization status and the users of our profile?
It would mean that the server would need to be able to send it, but we're not saying what situations where it must.
Versus should, where we're making a recommendation that a server has this capability.
Mm-hmm.
What do we think is more appropriate for the baseline?
Depends on which status field you're talking about.
In this case, it would be immunization status
And what is the definition?
for immunization status. Is that your question, Randy?
Sorry, I'm just wondering.
Oh, you cut off.
And so
Maybe put it in the chat. You're still kind of going a little in and out. I can pull up immunization in the meantime. So immunization status, it's a modifier. It's 1-to-1. and it's a required value set, meaning you have to send something, it has to be from this value set, and the population could change the meaning of the rest of the resource. So if we were to say shall, can send, is there risk here for immunization status?
The risk I see is that, again, like we've expressed before, that you will have situations where you don't know the status of the immunization. And so if you're talking about the immunization here,
If you
there's
don't
only
send
one status,
statuses,
right?
if you don't, in the case of this particular resource, if you don't send a status, the resources instance is not going to validate because it's one-to-one.
You know, but the situation is that we would only ever use completed, for example, and then forcing us, our vendors, to have to put this in as a hard-coded value. That's becoming messy.
That's what
But
you'd
if
have
they
to
don't, it's a non-conformant resource.
correct. I mean, there's other places where, like in our implementations, we've set the default and set a fixed value on a one-to-one resource element like this. But yeah, if you don't send at least a value, and that may be just always completed, Elliot's right. It's not going to validate. It's a non-conformant instance.
Is the thing that you're getting hung up on, Randy, that it's the demonstration component?
Well, it's the component expressed to us by, like, Sandra's and her group is basically saying that they don't want the applications coming and sending stuff that's meaningless just because the spec says you have to. And it's meaningless in our workflow.
There's nothing preventing private parties from agreeing to send non-conformant resources that they understand. But that's not FHIR.
And that's the issue. We want to try and stay as close as possible to this that we can. So that's what I'm looking at. There's certain points that we're going to end up having these kind of things where, from one perspective, it makes sense, but from another perspective, it doesn't make sense. Like,
We're
if
really
you're
having
using that status, I would say, like, in my mind, this is should and can send. But and that doesn't really fit that required thing, because really implies.
So I'm only catching about, well, less than half of what you're saying because you keep cutting out. But I think the question of whether you send conformant resources or not, and that would be conformant to FHIR, is a very separate discussion from these obligations, because these obligations are on a profile. And if you can't even validate against the base resource, you're not going to get to the point where you're validating against a profile or an actor's behavior with regards to a profile.
I'm still having trouble wrapping my head in terms of the shall and can send and the definition saying conformant application shall, should, may. I mean, what exactly does it say with the shall, should, may?
Well, you got to pick one of those three to go with it, right? So
Mhm.
you say shall, can send, or should, can send, or may, can send. So then you have the shall, should, or may applied to the can send.
So it'd be conformant application shall be able to correctly populate this element if we use that combination.
Right.
And then you can also have a should, can send.
Yep.
And you could say should, will send.
Mhm.
Yep.
So the should is not a hard requirement, and then the will is a hard requirement.
Well, I think this should actually almost lessens the hard requirement on the will send. We've been thinking about it like a shall because it's like, it seems much more rigid. But I think what this basically says is if you don't have the ability to enforce it and you're making a recommendation, then you use the should for this. And maybe someone down the line tightens it.
I will need to wrap my head more on this because it doesn't seem whatchamacallit this self-descriptive in terms of, you know, a will send combining with a should. You know, it's kind of a, to me, it's a conflicting requirement. Or
So
conflicting-
Zach, it's just telling you
take
how
an
tight that
imaginary
will
one.
is.
And say, you know, we expect most patients to have a name. And this is completely separate from any profiling that we've done. We expect most patients to have a name. You shall send, no, don't bring this up. Don't bring up the actual patient because this is not related to any profiling and it's completely imaginary. We say, you're always gonna, you shall send the patient name. And somebody comes along and says, I've got a case where either for anonymization purposes or to deal with John Doe's or for whatever other reason, I have a patient resource that doesn't have a name. You're now telling me I can't send you that resource. And so after discussion, whoever is doing that profile says, okay, you're right. There are cases where sending a name isn't the best, isn't always required. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the obligation from being a shall send into a should send. We're going to say you probably should be sending it, but there may be cases where it actually doesn't make sense. So we aren't going to make it a shall, we'll relax it to a should. And that's the kind of discussion that typically goes on within the standards groups when they're looking at shalls and shoulds to say, you know, are there exceptions? Is this, we recognize what best practice is, but we also recognize that there are cases where perhaps you can't meet the obligations of best practice. So we're gonna relax it a little bit into a should.
So it's a should send. So does that correlate to can send, will send?
Well, so the shall, should, and may modify what can send does. So if you have a shall can send, read that requirement as conformant applications shall be able to correctly populate this element. If it's a should can send, then read it as conformant applications should be able to correctly populate this element. Right? It's a modifier on the can send obligation and turns it into a shall send or turns it into a should send or a may send.
All right. I just need to wrap my head on this some more. But appreciate that, Elliot.
No problem.
So if we bring that to, let's say, vaccine code, we'll just step back from status for a second. Do you think that should will send is the right level? It's a 1-to-1, or do you think we need to go stricter with our expectation? So should be capable of sending this element, and if the element has a value that's allowed to be shared, include it when sending the resource. Seems kind of innocuous. Should we be going tighter?
That one almost seems like this should be shall will send. That way, as long as you're allowed. Because otherwise your vaccine doesn't make a lot of sense for vaccine immunization event.
Would anyone argue against something that looks like this? for producers. And this would be specifically for the baseline.
It does have the option of just putting in a text value, right?
Mhm.
Are there any conditions in which you would be communicating an immunization has happened, or is recommended to happen, given the various status reasons, but we don't know what the vaccine code is?
It might be, but that's why you need the description to sit there and say you're given vaccine for X. But you may not.
Yeah, I think particularly if you're capturing patient reports of historical records, you might, not have a code, but you might have to do text. But the codable concept lets you do the text.
Yeah. So we'll have the text there. So that allows us to fill that part in. Is there a case where we wouldn't have the text? I don't think so. So I think
Probably not, because you wouldn't know what would be the vaccination then if you don't know what vaccine was done or anything.
yeah, and that's where I'm kind of thinking. But Lorraine, you obviously have more experience in that area than I would. So I don't know if there would be a situation where there wouldn't be a code. Wouldn't be a code or a codable, a display value, text value that could represent. Yeah.
I can't think of a reason you would want to send an immunization without saying what immunization you're talking about, even if it was text.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't my space, but
So someone that wouldn't be using a DAR.
Well,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Is DAR allowed?
If it's a codable concept, I think usually it's conveyed in the value set. That's at least how it's done with IPS. Is this fair? Like, it's one thing to say, okay, as a consumer, the things that you care about, but from a producer standpoint, if you have this information, unlikely that you wouldn't have at least immunization text. Oh, I see, Rita, you've got your hand open.
Yeah, so I'm still struggling with, vaccine code is one-to-one cardinality. You absolutely have to send something. There is no other choice here. So what value add do we have by saying shall, will, send? It's always going to be shall, will, send if it's one-to-one. It's got to be there.
So that was one of the questions, maybe turned a different way, which was, we talked about modifier elements. We talked about elements that the spec doesn't allow for instance, erroring around. What do folks think? Basically, what I'd like to just highlight is that many of the places actually that we've applied must supports on are one-to-one elements. Is there value to surfacing this code just like there's value to surfacing the must support on minimum of one elements that goes beyond conformance?
So cardinality is different than must support. You have to be able to send a value in here. Is different from the value that you put in here needs to make sense, or when you receive it, you need to understand that value and do something with it. you know, you have to be able to populate a jurisdictional health number is different than you need to understand, you know, when you receive an OHIP number, doing something with that.
But does that apply on the producer end?
Yeah, there's places where you could be stuffing in dummy values just to populate a required element. You could have, you know, this is stepping away from the obligations and how the obligations express things, but your must support could be that not only do you have to populate something in here, but it has to somehow relate to some, you know, some state of the system.
So that might be a good point to like throw a couple of these. Okay, so yeah, these are cardinality min of 1 at this exercise and see, do we come to a conclusion around whether or not there is additional intent that we get specifically out of obligations? It may be that intent, Elliot, you're referring to is something we only get out of the must supports, but I think we should evaluate it because there's only going to be a handful of places where we don't have a must support, where we have a must support, but it's not on a minimum element so far in the baseline. But we got one code down today and we learned about modifiers. So I'm counting that as a win because actually I think that's going to be really helpful for us moving forward. All right. Thanks, folks. I'm going to stop the recording and I will see you all a week from now.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Have a great day.